This is the second of 3 community discussions that the Women of Color Initiative is hosting in the wake of the ongoing spread of the coronavirus, a disease we know that has a disproportionate effect on people of color. During this time, we focused our efforts on safety, healing, and renewal. And we thought it important on the heels of National Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month that we uplift and honor the voices and realities of our Asian Pacific Islander sisters. And I think it is even more timely that we are holding this panel now as we see all of our diverse people, all of our women of color, either online, on the phones, or in the street, protesting for the rights of African Americans and Black people in the US to live their fullest, freest life. And we have our Asian American and Pacific Islander sisters walking with us in that struggle. I want to flag that the planning for tonight's panel was led by the members of the Women of Color Initiative's 2020 fellowship class. We are grateful for their work, and we look forward to the continued progress that they will no doubt continue to make as organizers, leaders, advocates, and decision makers in our community. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the first moderator for tonight, Preciosa Brown, a sophomore at UGA. I was accidentally muted. We won't let that stop us. So I'm going to repeat. It's my pleasure to introduce the first moderator for tonight, Preciosa Brown, a sophomore at UGA and a member of the UGA Filipino Student Association. Preciosa is a talented young woman whose volunteer activities include a work as a canvasser for the National Asian Pacific Islander NAPAV Association Women Forum and Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. She's also an advocacy intern for CPACS, the Center for Pan-Asian Community Services. Preciosa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tamika. I really appreciate the introduction. Once again, everybody, my name is Preciosa Bulawan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Welcome to this evening's panel. I will be the moderator for this evening's discussion, and it is a great pleasure to participate in the panel with our esteemed guests. As we all know, these are some challenging and uncertain times that we are currently living in, from a worldwide pandemic to present racial hatred outside in our streets. It is safe to say that communities of color are desperately hurting all over. We have invited you, panelists, to share your ideas and give concrete examples on towards successfully moving forward in the midst of these interlocking events. Tonight will be a 2-part discussion. This first segment, we have 3 panelists who are willing to discuss and answer some questions. They are Dresden Lackey, Angela Jung, and Natasha Bardwaj. If these 3 women could just introduce themselves, state your name, your pronouns, and your background.
Or should I go first?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay. So my name is Dresden Lackey. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a doctoral candidate in sociology at the Georgia State University here in Atlanta. My research currently centers on gendered racism in microaggression experiences for women of color, and I'm specifically looking at the experiences of Black and Asian American women.
I can jump in next. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Angela Jang. I use she, hers pronouns. And I'm the conservation organizer at the Sierra Club Georgia chapter. Basically what that means is I organize for anything and everything of our campaigns in the chapter. But right now, our current focus is on public transportation, specifically with Gwinnett and trying to get another MARTA vote on the ballot this November. And on trying to strive for 100% clean energy and its implementation in different Georgia cities. And of course, we couldn't do this without uplifting frontline environmental justice community in our work. So that's that.
Super. So I guess that's my turn now. Hi, everyone. My name is Natasha Bharadwaj. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Rutgers University, Newark, and getting my PhD in criminal justice. So I study the impact of gender inequality on crime and fear of crime, specifically in the South Asian context. So looking forward to the panel.
All right, everyone, thank you for introducing yourselves. And without further ado, let's get started on the first session for tonight's panel, A History of Xenophobia, Early Misconceptions, and the Rise of Racism. So, as we all know, fear of the unknown has been the most rampant emotion felt by all Americans, especially with this pandemic. It has never been seen before. And at this point, we don't even have a ready-made vaccine to be sent out to everyone. However, this pandemic that we're living in hasn't affected everyone equally. More people have been arrested for violating social distancing laws, and more Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color have been arrested than people who are not part of the minority. So with all of this, and with the fear of the unknown, as well as the mass shutdowns and cancellations of events worldwide, ranging from concerts and conventions and sporting events to people getting laid off and furloughed because their job is considered as non-essential, people are looking to put the blame on someone else. And unfortunately, because of misconceptions all around the globe, there have been a rise of racism and stereotyping amongst the Asian American community. And this session, the goal for this session is to combat that and set it to where we can explain that it's not true. So my first question would be to Natasha. How has fear of the unknowns and the anger felt by all Americans reflected on the Asian community?
Awesome. So thank you, Preciosa, for that question. So, I'm going to start with just what we call like a base life condition of a country, right? So I'm an undergrad professor. And I think one of the things that comes up in everything is how America has this base life condition of fear, right? And then fear has two main responses. I'm sure you guys have all heard about it, right? Fight or flight. So the idea is there's this sort of looming threat. Sometimes the threat is known, sometimes it's unknown. And let's be clear, right? In America, a lot of things are born out of fear. You look at racism, the need to buy in guns. A lot of my students talk about how they're scared of their homes being burgled, so they need to be prepared. And then usually what happens is because our risk is unknown, the kind of way to combat it is also miscalculated and overly inflated, right? Now, imagine this being coupled with political leaders validating our threats, stereotypes, you're instilling further fear. So it's only making the situation worse. So, I'm going to give you an example of where I thought everything started to go downwards with coronavirus coverage. So one of the earliest, I live in New York. So one of the earliest cases in New York was a woman, lived in Manhattan, had traveled abroad, and she was being quarantined at her home. The image we saw was of an Asian American crossing a street in Flushing. Now, Flushing is historically where a lot of people of color, especially Asian Americans, live, right? What does this do? From the beginning, you have labeling, you have like people defining how and where a certain community looks like. So you're already associating a certain community with what COVID-19 is going to look like, right? And again, to be clear, this is historically the case with a lot of other things. If you look at the war on drugs, opium was linked to Chinese populations, marijuana to Mexican, crack cocaine to Black community. So from the beginning, you see, right, you're demonizing a community by saying like they have harmful effects by using these drugs. So similarly, this sort of thing happens with COVID-19, right? And then in our case, we also have a, huge political leader who starts calling this the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, right? There's really no link between the community and the virus, but if you see public and if you have political leaders who have quite a lot of clout in today's world, start to synonymize these two terms, right? Then you start seeing images. Specifically in New York, it was heartbreaking. I saw a young man spraying Febreze in an Asian American man. And personally, my friends who, I'm an Indian, I face different kind of, different colors of communities of color face different kind of discrimination. So specifically during COVID, I see a lot of my Asian American friends start to talk about how I'm feeling uncomfortable in public. So, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that all communities face the same kind of discrimination, right? We all know about Asian Americans and the model minority men, right? So there's been this sort of, this sort of blanketing insulation from certain kinds of threat and discrimination, which starts to lift during COVID-19, right? So you start becoming uncomfortable in public spaces, right? During coronavirus, you sneeze, cough, as a non-person of color, you'll probably still get stared at. As a person of color, suddenly it's like there is something wrong here, and immediate fight or flight response comes in, right? So I just, again, want to be really clear. There's absolutely no link between COVID-19 and any community, right? Except for how it's disproportionately affecting people of color. So that also plays in suddenly, but actually that's just a result of how the public health system has failed so many of our communities of color, right? And again, because of the misinformation spreading, right? So the information about the virus spreads, but at the same time, you have a lot of misinformation being spread. So we're battling with so many different things. And I think misinformation is a great way. People read what they want to read, and they start to feel comfortable rather than questioning. And this leads to so many kind of reactions, right? So I think the most important thing to really realize is at the end of the day, we're left with misinformation, we're left with a political climate, which is pretty anti-minorities. And then you have to realize that people start to protect themselves by giving into these tropes. So I think, I think that's what I'm just going to really leave it, because at the end of the day, it's just this fear that's based on misinformation, miscalculated risk, right? And again, not knowing how to deal with this. As you said, we don't have a vaccine, but people need to direct their anxiety and fear towards something. And this, unfortunately, falls towards Asian American people right now. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, Natasha. And I definitely agree with you that there shouldn't be a link with COVID-19 and any community of color. However, that's just the reality there is. And I wanted to thank you for mentioning terms like the Wuhan virus, because that is actually going to let me segue into my next question. And this is for you, Angela Jung. So what impacts do terms like Wuhan virus, bat suit, Kung flu, and conspiracy theories roaming around Twitter like China created the China bioweapon murder death child killer virus in China that have perpetuated stereotypes on how the virus came to be?
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Preciosa. And you just put a lot out there, and it's all affecting so many Asian Americans. I just first want to start off that when we talk about being Asian American, we think about how many identities and nationalities are encompassed within the identity. We're talking about at least 50 countries and nationalities within the identity of what it means to be Asian American. So this, centering it around China, and I mean, and all my condolences to Chinese Americans, especially in this country, but even beyond that, identities beyond Chinese Americanism are being erased by the rhetoric that we're seeing in this country, and erasure is a larger symptom of trying to succumb into whiteness and a dominant white culture that happens in this country, and a lack of pride that Asian Americans can feel that they can express and then within their own culture, because it's erased. We're all seen as Chinese American, and our nationalities are stripped of our identity, and it's a huge shame. And I think the second and last point I want to make about when these very hurtful terms I brought up is that we're felt and being used as political bargaining chips against a political war between the United States and China. And the cost is that there's a rise in racism and literal violence that happens against Asian Americans when we're used as essentially like a scapegoat between tense US-Chinese political situations right now. And it's not worth it. It's not worth the cost of human lives. It's not worth the danger of especially older Asian Americans living here in this country. But it's a shame because we're scapegoats, essentially, stripped of our own personal identities.
I definitely resonate you with that. And I feel like I'm definitely not the only one who has gone through this, but when I was growing up, I was always asked, "Oh, are you Chinese?" Even though like I am ethnically Filipino. So like okay, so if you were like asked if you're Chinese one time, and it's not out of like trying to stereotype or like put you on the spot, like you could excuse someone for just being ignorant and they just didn't know. But like if it builds up over time, because every single year ever since middle school, I've always been asked, "Are you Chinese? Are you Japanese?" As if they were the only two countries in Asia, which is honestly what, the largest continent on Earth? Yeah, definitely. But I also wanted to bring up the fact that this xenophobia and racism that Asian Americans have gone through is nothing new at all. And I kind of wanted to ask you specifically, Dresden, is COVID-19 the only instance of xenophobia that Asian Americans have experienced? How have past racist phenomena and policies, like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, have affected Asian Americans?
Yeah, so thank you, Preciosa. So of course, xenophobia, like you said, against Asian Americans and against Asians in the US is not new, because we know, of course, that it's rooted in white supremacy, right? And white supremacy is definitely not new. The US has a long history of anti-Asian sentiments, both in practice and in written law. So this legalization of anti-Asian sentiments. So for example, like you mentioned, when the Chinese laborers first came to the US to build this nation's railroad system in the late 19th century, they were really portrayed by white nativists as unclean, as sexually aggressive, as dangerous, because they were all male, right? And they were seen as this, or painted and portrayed as this very dangerous group of people. And this fear of the yellow peril really paved the way for the Chinese Exclusion Act to be passed in 1882, which was actually, it marked the first law in the history of the US that banned an entire ethnic group from immigrating here. And that, of course, was followed shortly after by the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement that restricted Japanese immigration as well. So then we can, of course, fast forward to the early 1840s when FDR signed the Executive Order 9066, which called for the incarceration of Japanese Americans into concentration camps. And most of these folks were US citizens. I think it was like over 2/3 of the folks that were incarcerated were US citizens. Some were even third and fourth generation. The US was all that they had ever known, all that their families had ever known. And this order was accompanied by additional propaganda, legal propaganda that was distributed by the US government that portrayed Asian Americans as sneaky, as un-American, as malicious. And it once again painted, of course, this image of the yellow peril. So we see how xenophobia and racism against Asian Americans can be exercised not only on, a personal level, like what we're seeing with the rise in hate crimes with COVID, but also on a legal systemic level, right? This is legal racism that we have a history of. And we must remember that, the mentioned examples are legally enforced. So going back to what Angela was saying about Asian Americans, being scapegoats, this is really relevant when we look at the history of the US as well, and Asian Americans, history here. Ultimately, these policies are indicative of the way that Asian Americans can really be weaponized into this dichotomy, where on one end you have yellow peril, and then on the other you have the model minority myth, which is again rooted in anti-Blackness, right? Rooted in white supremacy and ultimately rooted in anti-Blackness, which is extremely relevant now with everything going on. And when it's convenient to paint Asian Americans as dangerous, we are painted as dangerous. When it's beneficial to paint us as the only non-whites who don't rock the boat and pit us against Black and brown counterparts, that's happening too. So yeah, this is not new.
Thank you for sharing, Dresden. And I definitely resonate with all your points. Like, we are either the model minority or the yellow peril. And it's just funny to me how we could flip like back and forth just like that, just to fit the white supremacist narrative. So I wanted to ask you again, Angela, because of all the racist stereotypes found on the internet currently, and because of the historical xenophobia that Asian Americans have faced, what microaggressions have our community faced throughout this pandemic?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Preciosa. And I'm just going to give a brief content warning of if it's triggering or if there's, especially on mental health and suicide, because I'm going to make a tie there. It's been rough, y'all. I mean, we've seen from things where I've seen videos on Facebook of peers who've been on buses and been told to go back to China, repeatedly being chanted by folks, and or being told that you speak very good English, comes off as a compliment or trying to come off with good intentions, but the impacts are real. And where I want to go with that is that even before this pandemic, there's a lot of racist microaggressions that feed into this constant feeling as an Asian American that you're a foreigner in the very own land that you grew up and were raised in. I mean, Dresden just said that there are folks who came here. The first Asian American diaspora was here in the early 1900s. And there are folks who are fifth or sixth generation Asian American, and it seems like America has completely forgotten its history, or maybe it's not written in our own textbooks when you're growing up. There is essentially no Asian American history, or barely any mention, except for the productivity that we've provided to this country in history growing up. And this is traumatizing, right? I mean, there are literally studies on how these microaggressions, from exotization of Asian women being beautiful in very grotesque ways, to Asian men being less desirable, to using chopsticks, or the cuisines that I eat are less tolerable or more gross than what white Americans do, or that anything that we can prove ourselves to be is inferior or is seen as a threat to whiteness. This all wears down in your mind, and something that I just, and the reason why I wanted to bring up a content warning that is overlooked when it comes to being Asian American in America is that for Asian Americans between the ages of 15 to 24, the leading cause of death is suicide. And And this is not examined very well or talked about enough in Asian American circles, because how we are trained to respond to racist microaggressions is to lean more into being the model minority and to lean more into whiteness. And this means that we put more pressure on ourselves to have higher levels of education, to have better jobs or better paying jobs. Our imagination and our realities of what it means to be Asian Americans are limited by this pressure to succumb into whiteness. And it has literally deathly consequences for particularly young Asian Americans in America. So yes, it has a strong impact. But I do want to point out that after COVID, this is something we should be very worried about and should keep talking about, because it has existed long before COVID has hit.
I definitely agree with you. And this is definitely a conversation that should be kept talking about. So speaking about COVID, about March or April, around that time, Governor Kemp did decide to reopen the economy prematurely. And this has proven dire consequences. Mm-hmm. So Natasha, do you think that Governor Kemp's decision to reopen Georgia's economy made the situation for Asian Americans better or?
That's a really pressing question, you know, so I was trying to look up numbers and everything, and guess what? There's no data out there. So if you just look at it like fact-wise, right, obviously the number of deaths is, I think there's a 120% increase, and this is looking across all communities. In terms of cases, there's a 100% jump. But now let's look at the effect of the Asian American community being made kind of synonymous with COVID-19. That's something we can't undo now. It's too late, right? And, you know, as Justin also talked about, there's an underlying political agenda that needed to be established, right? So if you read up, right now there's a bill being tabled to stop a certain kind of Chinese student from coming in on certain visas. We have this sort of travel bans coming out of it. So I think, you know, I honestly, I really struggled with this idea of why would we reopen an economy? Like, I don't get it. Like, to me, it doesn't make sense because it's like, I guess, you know, I'm not an economist, but I remember, you know, speaking with my research advisor and being like, don't people make an economy? And if all your people are dying, who's driving this economy? So I think, you know, so many people can say that, you know, businesses are dying, we need it. I agree, you know, there should be no more suffering, but let's be honest, America has the highest death rate. The amount, those 100,000 lives are never coming back, right? So you can look at it from that side, right? What's more important, people or economy, and right? But I think when it comes to the damage being done to the Asian American community, it's done. You know, as Angela was saying, I think it's something we're gonna have to pay attention to, right? Dispelling misinformation is something I, as a researcher, really struggle with. You know, India has a huge way of spreading information through this group called WhatsApp, right? It's a thing, and people are just constantly consuming, not questioning. And one of the things I work with my students is, please question this source. What kind of agenda is being set here, right? So until and unless we can really use this as a learning experience, because really there is no data to support that this is coming from a certain community. This is not coming from a certain community. It's going to be a long battle ahead. So I think if you want to think about Georgia reopening, I don't know. I think people will be out and about. That's going to increase the exposure, not just to the virus, but also to this sort of misguided anxiety and anger that's going to be there now in the public sphere. So it's going to be tough. Georgia is in one way going to kind of lead the way in us understanding what this means. I am worried, but I want to be optimistic. But yeah, I think the damage has been done, but you know, the optimist in me will say that this is a good time for us to really start working actively to dispel misinformation. and really make sure that some amount of the damage can be addressed. Yes.
Right. Thank you for your thoughts, Natasha. And so that concludes our first session. And here we've talked about the background of why xenophobia against Asian Americans exists. And because of all the misinformation that has spread before and after the economy reopening, the damage has been extremely bad, and people have been getting harassed on the streets just for having Asian American traits, and people have been harassed and been told to go back to your country online. And we will actually be talking about more on the effects of the pandemic and what we can do about it for the next session, session 2. So thank you to all of our session 1 panelists who have shared your thoughts and expertise on these issues. Thank you for opening up the conversation. And we will be actually taking a 5-minute intermission. During this time, you're more than welcome to turn your camera off, go to the bathroom, go get some food, get a glass of water, and we will be reconvening after minutes.
New reality, our new normal. We ask you to do 3 things in support of yourself and in support of our network. First, be gentle and loving towards yourself. Please give yourself some grace in these difficult times. Second, talk to us online. Share your stories. Share our social media with your friends, family, and other women of color who can benefit from the care, support, and encouragement we are providing online. And finally, uplift and use your voice in the coming days by filling out the census and voting in the upcoming primary elections. You can complete the census online. You can also vote during this primary using the vote by mail option. If you haven't already, please return the absentee ballot request form you should have received from the Secretary of State's office as soon as possible. Your collective voice will create the groundwork of our victories together, and the Women of Color Initiative is here and looks forward to partnering with you on this new movement that we are all building together. You matter, our communities matter, and we thank you for all that you do.
Welcome back, everyone. Was everyone able to take just a 5-minute breather, just to go get some water, take a break? Right. Sounds good. I wanted to take a second to acknowledge everybody in the audience who's watching from our Zoom webinar and the Facebook Live. Thank you all for coming in and watching. We truly appreciate you wanting to learn more and join the conversation. So without further ado, let's get started on session 2, the impact of racism, current events, and how to be an effective ally. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce our panelists and my co-moderator, Faria Khan, who is also with me a Win of Color Initiative Social Justice Fellow. So if our panelists for session 2 could introduce your name, your pronouns, and your background.
I'll start it off just as co-moderator. Hey guys, I'm Faria. My pronouns are she, her, and yeah, that's it.
Hi, I'm Lily Pabian with We Love BUHI. I'm the executive director there, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Hello, hi, I'm Ruth McMullen. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am an associate judge in Gwinnett County Magistrate Court, and generally, I guess you could say I'm a woman of multicolors.
I'm Bonnie Yoon. I'm Bonnie Yoon. Yes, she, her, hers. I currently am doing legal recruiting. I'm on the board of the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association, together with Angela Hsu, who's the president. And I practiced immigration law for many years. I'm ethnically Korean, but I was born and grew up in the Philippines.
And my name is Angela Hsu. My day job is I'm a lawyer with Brian K. Blayton Paisner, and I'm the president of the Georgia Asian Pacific Bar Association, and my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. So as we mentioned from session 1, many things have led up to the hatred and the violence that Asian Americans unfortunately have to face on a daily basis due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Lily, I know that you are associated with We Love Buford Highway. And for those of you who don't know, Buford Highway is a street, and it goes from Buford, Georgia to Doraville and Chamblee, Georgia, which is in the metro Atlanta area. And Buford Highway is known for the huge farmers market that a lot of ethnic groups like to go shop at because a lot more imported goods are available there. And it's also known for many ethnic restaurants and cafes where you can go to. So knowing that Buford Highway is home to a lot of small ethnically owned businesses, Lily, how have Asian American businesses in general and the ones in Buford Highway have been affected by the pandemic?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so when we talk about Buford Highway, it is an extraordinarily long stretch of highway, right? State 13 or Route State 13. For Buford Highway, and in this conversation, and certainly with our mission, we're looking at the 8-mile stretch, just about a half mile north of 285 going north, and down where, right around North Druid. So we're really hitting 3 municipalities, Doraville, Chamblee, and Brookhaven. And I just wanted to kind of give you guys a footprint. In terms of, you know, our mission is really about preserving. I mean, this is our area. This is our Chinatown. This is our little Mexico, little Havana, little Bangkok, and it's all, and little Koreatown. It's all on this stretch, and it's represented, and it's beautiful. It's multicultural. It has been here for 40 years. My first home was on Buford Highway. The apartments are still there. And it's just a second place. A lot of people call it second home, because this is where we really figured out who we were. You know, I'm a Chinese American. But my parents, you know, they immigrated here from China to Taiwan to New York to here, and along the way, as that younger generation, we kind of got lost of who we were, and so Buford Highway really helped us in terms of our identity and sort of grounding us and learning our heritage and roots. In terms of business, that, you know, of course, the businesses, the small businesses, the restaurants, they make up such a big part of the landscape of what it is that we're trying to preserve, because they're just a big piece of it. I will tell you that, and as most of you know, the effects of COVID started hitting in January, right around the Lunar Festival, that last weekend in January. We were celebrating it at Chinatown, as we do every year for 30 years, having a big festival. And you could just see the decrease in population. And then, you know, part of my work is to go out into the field and really talk to businesses. And particularly Chinatown, they did see a huge slow of traffic and business. I think, you know, at some point it was a 40% decrease. Back then it started. And then, you know, as we sort of go through current events and how we led up to where we're at now, May 19th, there was a protest in Chinatown, and it was against Chinese businesses. It says that China's taking over US businesses. And, you know, these guys have been here forever. Seriously, 30 years, 35 years. I mean, it wasn't a violent protest, but it shook up a lot of the businesses. I got an immediate text of, hey, just want to let you know this is going down, you know, and these merchants, it frightened them. It shook them up. And then, you know, even before that, we were seeing, somebody had mentioned the Wuhan plaques were, you know, around Atlanta. And, you know, it had, you know, Winnie the Pooh, and it had a bat. And then we had restaurant owners that would say that they would just get calls of, ooh, you guys, you know, you serving bat soup, or, you know, how much is that bat soup? And just very, you know, it's just a visceral sort of anger against that. You know, even as we were in session one, you know, I grew up here, but you hear the vernacular and the words that are being used, and it just makes you just so angry, and it brings back a lot of childhood stuff too, you know. So anyway, and so, you know, recently I've reached out to, you know, as I do with all these businesses, and a woman came up. She's like, I've lost 60% of my business. I don't even know how to, you know, get back on my feet. So it's been very, very impactful, particularly with our AAPI communities and business owners, for sure.
Right. Thank you for sharing. So someone in the chat actually, what are some actions that the public can do right now to help Asian American businesses?
Well, you know, and that's the question we always ask. And I think there actually was a campaign that was going around, and it was a brilliant campaign, that's just ask the question, what is it do you need? What is it? How can we help? And the biggest way right now is amplifying their business, getting the word out. You know, a lot of them immediately had, I mean, the carpet was just pulled out from under, and not just AAPI communities, all over small businesses. And they had to pivot very quickly. They had to redefine themselves. What we do see, and what we have seen for years, is, you know, a lot of businesses that don't offer electronic payments. They're cash business. Or a lot of them that don't even know, they don't have time for social media. They're like, you know, I got a Gmail, Yahoo account. I barely even check that because I'm heads down running my business as they should, right? And as it has worked for so long. So I think the biggest message is, and what we've tried to do is really just help market them, help them get the word out. What are your operation hours? what is it that you're doing to build even the confidence of your clientele, of your customers? And they've done a really good job. I think they've really they've had to regain confidence as well in this process. I mean, this is an emotional Ferris wheel, right? So they've been through the ringer, but I feel like there is some positive coming out on the other side, in that, you know, it's that immigrant spirit. They are resilient and they are working through it. But as much as we can patron them, as much as we can support them in that way, I think is really helpful.
Right. Thank you so much, Lily, for sharing. And I see that although it's been very impactful, that we do have the power to help. So Asian American businesses have been affected, whether they are Chinese or not, because clump other Asian ethnicities together and just label everyone as Asian. So I have a question for you, Bonnie. Although many Asian Americans of other ethnicities have stood with the Chinese community throughout the pandemic, throughout the racism, other fellow Asian Americans have decided not to associate themselves and even discriminate against the Chinese. For example, a viral tweet on Twitter featured an Asian American being told by his mother to speak Thai in public so as to not be confused with being Chinese. What are your thoughts and experiences being Asian but not being Chinese, and how can we effectively stand in solidarity with each other?
Thank you, Preciosa. I think this question actually has a lot to do with how recently your family came as an immigrant, or also it might be generational, because for older Asian Americans, their parents who immigrated at a relatively older age, the identity of recognizing yourself as Korean American, Filipino American, you know, Chinese American is much more prevalent. But the longer you stay in the United States, I found my own journey to immigrating to the United States. I came actually for college, and hey, I'm Korean at that time, right? And but I was born and I grew up in the Philippines, so I had this sort of confusion as to what my own identity was. But over time, I saw my own identity begin to emerge. I had first initially thought, okay, I'm Korean American, or if I hung out with Filipinos, I was Filipino American. But that became Asian American, and it became very apparent after just my own experiences of, you know, being asked constantly, oh, you know, you speak English so well, or, you know, gosh, you know, are you the interpreter rather than the attorney? That Americans who are born here in the United States, or I will say maybe Caucasian or non-Asians, just lump all Asians together. And I know that the appearance of somebody, I hearken back to when the Japanese Americans were interned, and there are these older sort of cartoons that are trying to distinguish the Japanese eye slant characteristics versus the Chinese eye slant characteristic to distinguish people. But that just pits us all against one another versus unifying ourselves so that we can, you know, present ourselves as American, right? So my understanding of uniting ourselves, I mean, yes, I can tell my parents, or perhaps this Thai child could tell her mom, you know, they don't see me as necessarily, you know, Chinese or Thai. I mean, I actually don't think that people who listen to her speaking in Thai would think it's Thai. They'd probably think it's Chinese, right? And my identification working within the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association is to be as inclusive of all Asian backgrounds as possible. You know, we are all in it together, and, you know, push comes to shove, we're people of color as opposed to not people of color, right? And I know I'm taking up a little bit more time, but we have to bring this conversation a little bit to the conversation of what's happening right now outside, right? The convulsions of rage following the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, you know, these questions of race. And I just read the article about how, you know, one of the police officers who had looked away from the death of George Floyd happens to be Asian American, right? And so what are we doing as Asian Americans also to confront our own prejudices and to acknowledge what our own brainwashing of whiteness or trying to be complicit with privilege, white privilege, is preventing us from being more supportive of people who are suffering from all of this rage and anger right now.
Thank you for sharing, Bonnie. I definitely agree with you. So because of the unity, well, rather the lack of unity that our community has and the lack of unity that America has in general, whether it be the xenophobia caused from COVID-19 or any other social issues, there's just such a divide between groups, and it's really hard to just come together. So because of this and many other factors that we've discussed so far, there has been a global rise of hate crimes against Asians. And one of them in particular that was heavily covered on the news early on and during the pandemic was this attack on Singaporean student Jonathan Mok while he was in London. And many other stories, such as the ones that are shared on CNN, Asian Americans have reported being harassed, being kicked, being told to go back to China, regardless of whether they were Chinese or not. They've been pushed and they've even been stabbed. So I have a question for you on these hate crimes. What kind of hate crimes have you seen or that you've heard of have been going on in your community? And what else would you like the public to be aware of?
Are you asking me? Or are you asking Angela?
I'm asking you.
We lost that. Preciosa? We missed some of that.
Yeah. Are you able to?
You're fading in and out a little bit.
Okay, so I was asking Ruth that because of all the xenophobia and racism going on, there have been a significant increase in hate crimes, especially with this one story that went viral about a Singaporean student named Jonathan Mok being attacked while he was away in university in London. So I wanted to ask you, Ruth, what kind of hate crimes have you heard of or do you know about that have been going on in your community? And what else do you want the general public to know?
I think that's a great question, Preciosa. As a judge in Gwinnett County, one of the things we do is write warrants for crimes that are happening in Gwinnett County. And I'm actually quite happy to say that I haven't seen any of those, haven't heard any of physical hate crimes or crimes committed against someone because of their Asian background or perceived Asian background. Now we did, I think Lily did mention the stickers or plaques or whatever it was that was being posted around downtown Atlanta on some of the restaurants. And, you know, we get the reports of the slurs and the prank phone calls and the general, just disrespect. But in terms of physical assaults and things like that, I haven't seen any in Gwinnett County or in Metro Atlanta. Now, when I was looking at the Anti-Defamation League, they are tracking reports nationwide, and the list is extensive. All kinds of physical assaults, from pushing and shoving to stabbing, to screaming and yelling in people's faces. Thankfully, it's not happening as much here in Atlanta. But there are some other crimes that I have seen happening to our Asian community. And especially, I think, because of what Lily mentioned, that a lot of them are small business owners. They're not very tech savvy. They may not handle in credit cards or, all cash. So they're being preyed upon by the COVID-19 relief funds. I've seen a lot of fraudulent activity targeting immigrant communities. We'll help you get your business stimulus package. Text messages, random text messages going out saying, put your information in here and we'll help you get that stimulus check, things like that. And I think people pretending to be immigration lawyers will help you, get the visa that they're saying you can't come anymore. We'll help you get that straightened out. They're not lawyers, and they're preying particularly on the immigrant community. And I think that's the bigger problem, is getting the message to our business owners. Don't click that link. Don't respond to that text message. Don't send your EIN number to an email that you didn't solicit. Don't trust somebody to do your taxes if you've never heard of them before and they randomly text you. That's not legit. But it happens, and I've had plenty of people send me screenshots of that. And, I think that's the biggest thing that's affecting our community is, they're so eager for help. They don't know where to turn. English may not be their first language or a strong language. So someone reaches out with an offer to help, we tend to go for that. And then we get suckered, and not only is your personal information compromised, but your business information is too.
Oops. Hey guys, so I wanted to come in and start the Q&A. I've gotten some really good questions in the chat, and I've had some DM to me as well. So anybody can step in here. Let's start off. This is one question that I had personally. Can we explain the model minority narrative? I know a lot of us know it. I know that not everybody in the chat knows about it. So maybe if we can just explain what that is, how that's damaging, and just because we did talk about it earlier, I'm not sure if everybody knows what that is. If somebody can jump in.
I'm happy to jump in since I'm actually doing a bit of research on it right now. So the model minority myth is basically saying it's labeling a certain minority, which is Asian Americans, that because you got an education and you worked hard, you're the model minority, right? So other minorities should look at you as a way of making it, right? So this is deeply problematic at so many levels, right? Because first of all, you're clubbing everybody together, right? You're completely pretending like no differences culturally, ethnically exist. Secondly, as I talked in the beginning, the kind of discrimination faced by Asian Americans is very different from the consistent dehumanization of the Black community, right? Since during slavery. So I think when you put them all on the same pedestal, you're first of all erasing differences. And you're also erasing the ability, you're basically putting the onus of making it on the individual, right? So you're saying that structural inequalities don't exist in the first place. So as long as you get an education, you work hard, you can make it. But what about the structural inequalities in place that ensure I don't get an education, I don't have access to public health, I don't have access to so many resources, right? And I think what's inherent within this is its affinity to whiteness. So, if it's okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the South Asian community, right? I've been brought up where the color of my skin is brought up all the time because it's not typically brown. So you won't get racist attacks, right? And it's been very painful because there's a huge amount of colorism in my South Asian community. And is the same thing. This model minority myth basically puts this false pretense that we're insulated. So as long as the discrimination is not so bad, why do we need to speak out? And our affinity to whiteness becomes anti-Black, right? So there's just so many layers to it. And, you know, as a criminologist, I'm really upset that we haven't even like studied it. You know, full shout out to Dresden. I know she's a sociologist and I know there's some amount of work, but it's just so limiting because I'm really ashamed, to be honest. This is the first time I've read about it, and I've been working in this field for like 12 years. So I think, as especially, you know, to the South Asian community, I think it's very important because anti-Black sentiments are very high, and we look at it from a colorist point of view, right? But it's not very different. I mean, they're two different. Racism and colorism are different, but the affinity to whiteness is juxtaposed against anti-Black. So it's very important. And you know, this false pretense that as long as I'm okay, I don't have to be part of the collective is what's damaging. So, you know, I don't want to take up too much time. So yeah.
Dresden, I know you may have something to say about that. Did you want to comment or add anything? I think you're muted right now.
Am I? Oh.
I think we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't find it because I have the chat up. No, I think Natasha really, really nailed it. It's ultimately like it is about colorism, and it's mono minority myth is very inherently linked to anti-Blackness, and that was kind of going back to what I was saying prior when you know, we think of these things in a dichotomy, and it really comes down to how Asian Americans can be used to be seen as this you know, the superior minority, because then it makes Black people the bad minority, right? It's back into this pitting people of color against one another, because then you're not looking at ultimately building coalitions to combat white supremacy, which is what they don't want. So yeah, and I plugged it in to the chat. My dissertation chair and a professor at GSU actually did her master's thesis and wrote a book on the myth of the mono-minority. Dr. Rosalind Chow, you can check out that if it's new to you. But yeah, I think Natasha really nailed it there.
And I wanted to go back to Angela Shu. Please correct me if I mispronounce that. Sorry, so we did miss over your questions. So we wanted to ask you, do you know of any recent legislation or other legal actions that are being taken or, you know, in progress to combat the hate crimes against Asian Americans? If not, what do you suggest that policymakers and the public can do to decrease these hate crimes? How can we be a part of that as a community?
So there are 46 of the 50 states. 46 of the states have actual hate crime legislation. Georgia's actually, interestingly enough, not one of them. Here's Judge Ruth going, no. I mean, it's really pretty stunning for a state as diverse as ours that we do not actually have a hate crime statute in the books. I think that tells you something. I think what that speaks to is, you know, for Asian Americans, I'll start with that. One of the problems is underreporting. And I think a few of the speakers spoke about that. There's an underreporting problem. There are people that don't really understand that there are hate crime statutes out there. They have resources that they can, you know, report. I think especially in immigrant communities, there's gross underreporting. Some people probably fearful because of immigration status. But I think that one of the reasons why, you know, Georgia, for example, doesn't have a hate crime statute is because of a lot of hate crimes and a lot of things are invisible to people who don't experience them. And I think that's the real power of what we're seeing right now with, you know, with Ahmaud Arbery and, you know, and with the Floyd case and all these different cases. So many of them have been driven to the surface with cell phone cameras. So some of the people that are on this call right now are not, I'm older, I'm 51, you're younger, and you have not lived in a world where you didn't have a cell phone camera at all times. And I think that's a really powerful tool. I mean, it sounds maybe a little bit silly, but it's such a powerful tool to shine a light on things that would otherwise be invisible because it is not your experience. So, you know, as an Asian American lawyer who lives in Sandy Springs, like a lot of these things, my child is not likely to have a police person step on his neck until he dies. Like that's not my experience. But here's the thing is, and Preciosa talked about unity earlier. And one of the things that I've always thought is that a lot of these problems get marginalized into communities. It's like, it's a Black problem. It's an Asian problem. It's an everybody problem. It's a human being problem. It's an American problem. And the problem is until we decide as a country that we're going to own these problems as our own, they have a cost. We all pay. We all pay, every single one of us. We pay for these problems in a very real and tangible way. But it's way too easy to say. And what's disheartening also is that some people are taking the approach within these communities saying it's really it's a Black problem, stay out of it. It's an Asian problem, stay out of it. No, we need all the allies we can get. And I love that you guys, you've assembled a very diverse group of women who can work together and collaborate. That's what it's going to take. It's really going to take a certain amount of ownership of all these issues before real change happens. But we have to stop pretending like the things that only seem to affect one particular group really, that we can be distant from them and they don't affect the rest of us, because they do. And so I think that's really the driver, that we as a public need to change how we think about this stuff, how we frame it, how we talk about it, how we internalize it, how we deal with it. We can't just say that it's an us and them, or we're going to unify as an Asian community and as a Black community. It's got to be bigger than that. That's the only way we're going to get there. And and it does, what's going on right now with, there are people that, that are supporting a certain amount of violence and rioting. I understand the anger, I really do get it. But I think that what I really want to see is that righteous anger be channeled into real engagement, where I really want to see young people go out there and vote, because they don't really understand what a huge difference. It's the youth vote, guys, kids that are on this call right now, that are on this webinar, you got to go out and vote. You got to get all your friends to go out and vote, because that's really going to make a difference. Be empowered, feel empowered to go out like you guys are and study and work hard and really change all these narratives. And that's, that's kind of my reflection on all that's happening.
Thank you for that, Angela. I also wanted to direct the same question kind of to Judge Ruth. After that, I'm going to go to Lily and then Angela Jang. So the same thing, what are some things that we in the public can kind of do to engage in these conversations and then work towards policy that could combat like some of these hate crimes, not even just the Asian American community, but other communities as well?
I think Angela hit it right. Hit the nail right on the head. I'd actually pulled up, because everybody's fond of quoting Dr. King right about now. But there was one quote that that I've used in the past, and I think it's very apropos to this situation that's going on today. And it says, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. So, and it goes on. That was from his letters from a Birmingham jail. And I think that what Angela said is right on point. Natasha hit on it too. In the Asian community, I grew up biracial. So my dad is Black and Native American from Alabama. My mother is Vietnamese with Chinese ancestry, actually more Chinese than she is Vietnamese, according to Ancestry.com. I was born in Vietnam. I was raised in Alabama, the only person of any color in my entire grade. So it is true that what happens to one, it does affect us all. And I was telling some of the panelists before this started, one thing that we can do as Asian Americans, we have to have these hard conversations, starting with our own family. If you are really honest with yourself, your family, you have family members that say some pretty racist things sometimes. I've had to call my mother out and say, wow, Mom, racist much? You know, I've had to say it to her because she said things and I'm like, that is so stereotypical. She said things when I moved here to go to law school and looked at an apartment in Clarkston, you know, and I'm like, have you looked at your husband and your children? Do you know what we are? You have to say these things and you have to be unafraid. I had to call my family out about their recent silence and just say, look, if you're not going to say anything, that's cool. But when you see me, don't tell me how much you miss my father who's passed away. I don't want to hear it. Because he has sons and grandsons still alive and they're still affected and they could be the next hashtag. So if you're not trying to talk to me about that, that's fine. We're still family, but I know and I'm listening. You have to have those conversations and it's very, very hard. And what Angela said to the young people, don't just vote, be an informed voter. There are agencies represented here tonight that do vetting of candidates. If these are issues that are important to you, these agencies have vetted all the candidates where they stand on these issues. They put out spreadsheets. Look at them and see if these candidates support the issues that are important to you, you know, and understand that it's the local elections that impact our communities much more than the national elections. I mean, things aren't great nationally right now, but you know, when people are talking about, just for example, the George Floyd medical examiner's report and how could that medical examiner issue a report like that? Well, let's talk about how voting goes into that. The medical examiner is appointed by the mayor. Guess what that means? You voted for the mayor to put that person in office, okay? In Georgia, the chief medical examiner is appointed by the director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, who is appointed by the governor. So this is why your vote matters. Your chief of police are appointed by the mayor or the council, the city council, depending on your municipality. So the chief of police is not responding to your issues or your concerns. You have to take it to their boss, who is the city council, the elected representative who put them in power. And if that person doesn't get it, guess who their boss is? Mm-hmm. You are.
I definitely agree. I definitely agree with you, Judge Ruth. And kind of to that point, there's also like the whole, the idea of language barriers and, you know, not being able to communicate with our own communities about our own needs. That's just another factor that, you know, that's something we can work on, getting people to translate and things like that. I'm going to now move on to the question with Lily. So the question is, along with social media campaigns like hashtag I'm not a virus, hashtag wash the hate, what are other actions everyday people can do to kind of be involved as well in the process, whether it's social media, whether it's how we were talking about policy making, local elections, just some other things that we can all be a part of and participate in?
Well, you know, I think it boils down to education and awareness and really, really understanding people's heritage and their struggles, their conflicts throughout their histories. I think that a lot of, you know, I know as a Chinese American and my family, you know, my grandfather was a general under Chiang Kai-shek and fighting just for rights and what they believed in. But the struggles between them and the Japanese had caused so much in our family and our narrative of prejudices. And how do you break those down? You have to know it, that it exists, where it came from. So I do think that just educating, understanding other people's heritage and struggles is a big part of it. And have conversations. I mean, you know, have these dialogues like we're doing now, you know, and I think that what I've been seeing in the last, you know, couple weeks, it's the ugly side of all of this. And then the flip side is that you kind of have to go through the ugly side to get the conversation on the table and for people to talk about it in a really raw way. And it's uncomfortable. I mean, it is. I mean, when Judge Ruth was talking about just Asians as being prejudiced, and I mean, there's just so much of that, even with my own family growing up. And so you kind of have to look at yourself too. You know, there's a lot of self-awareness and all of it. It's all tied together. But I really think that it's worth it in the end. I think it's almost at a point where we have to. There is no other choice.
Yeah, and I do want to add a little to that. I think that's wonderful that you mentioned that, because it seems like information, engagement, and dialogue is missing. We're in an era where people are really shouting each other down, and it's really heartbreaking to me that we're in an era where both sides, people are just not listening, and that I think really is the antithesis of how you solve this. If the question is framed around how do you solve this, you've got to, like Lily's saying, and Judge Ruth is saying, like, take a hard look at yourself, your own family, but get the right information, have access to the right information, have access to legitimate news sources. Don't, fall for the clickbait. Engage and have a dialogue. Have a dialogue with people who disagree with you. And I think that can be a hard thing to do, especially in the age of, shouting people down.
Thank you for that, Angela. So I'm going to direct this question to Angela Jen. This is a question that was raised in the chat, and anyone can jump in after. How do the panelists think about the ideas of multiculturalism versus cultural assimilation? Can you explain, the difference between that, just whatever implications that comes with?
Yeah, thanks for directing that question. I think first, in organizing terms, I don't want to, for anyone that's listening in the audience, I want to be fully aware that you can define multiculturalism and cultural assimilation in very different ways. So I just want to break it down for anyone out there. Cultural assimilation, it's a lot of what we've been talking about, is assimilating to the dominant hegemony, AKA the dominant group in power within America, which in this case is wealthy white Americans. And so cultural assimilation is being pressured to, I guess, lean into that culture over your own culture of heritage. And then multiculturalism, I think that just can be defined in many different ways. It's, I think the ideal is that we talk a lot about American melting pots. And I think people have heard the analogy that we're more like a salad, that folks on this call have really alluded to a lot of division and silos, lack of solidarity between ethnic groups. Angela's, the other Angela has really hit on that. And I think that the thing to consider here is it's not even a versus in a sense, it's more of trying to overcome cultural assimilation and trying to resist assimilating to the broader dominant culture, to be able to feel like we can confidently bring up our individual identities. Everyone that has brought up here is a lot of really racial identity development is at the core of why we try and self-educate and why we commit ourselves to self-transformation, and why we are trying to find where we identify, because there's not a lot of spaces when you think about growing up in America where you can identify your identity if you're not white, right? We're putting so many resources out there in the chat about how to even examine and where to find resources on learning about Asian American identity, because it's not even in history books. Our history books have a very white colonial lens. So how many other histories are we not learning, from Native American, Indigenous folks to Black Americans? So I think when we talk, and just trying to tie it in today, and I just don't want to take up too much space here, tying it to today and everything that's happening with all the courage that's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. Multiculturalism and really brave multiculturalism means knowing when to take a step back and knowing what your role is, and being very critically aware of whose voices are being really suppressed in this space, whose histories are really being silenced during this time. And I think right now, I really call it to the Asian American community in particular, this is the moment for Black Americans. This is the moment to support our Black communities. This moment is theirs. And right now, I think it means that we have to re-educate ourselves as Asian Americans, and what we've been learning, because we have all been socialized in the exact same way from white supremacy, of having to eliminate anti-Blackness within our own systems, having to challenge whiteness within our own systems. This moment right now is the time we need to be in solidarity with Black Americans and the Black Lives Matter movements.
I wanted to say thank you, Angela, and everybody else was speaking. I think it's definitely something to take away, that the way we can be an ally for each other as different ethnicities, different racial groups, we have to be there for each other and engage in each other's conversations, because in the end, we just have to be together, and multiculturalism is a part of that. You know, appreciating other people's identities, making space for each other, and then, you know, really engaging in the conversation. So right now I'm going to give it back to Preciosa. Thank you guys for answering the Q&A. We had a few more questions, but, you know, unfortunately we're running out of time. So I'm going to give it back to Preciosa.
Okay. Thank you all so much for engaging. Thank you to the audience for engaging. In the interest of time, we'd kind of like to wrap everything up. Thank you everybody for participating in the panel. If Tamika, you wanted to give any last words and final statements?
Thank you, Preciosa, and thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you to the participants for putting out real thoughtful questions. Like, this was a real engaging conversation. The Women of Color Initiative, this is our second such panel, and I just have to say, I'm grateful that in both the first and second panel we've held, that our participants and our panelists have been authentic, they have been honest, they have been vulnerable. And I think these are conversations because they are recorded, that people are gonna find, I think, strength and hope and some ideas from. I just wanna say a few things. One is, you know, we've seen some signs at rallies and protests recently that say Yellow Peril supports Black power. And we had talked about what it means earlier. I think it may have been dressed in to reclaim a narrative, right? And to flip it on its head and to make it our own as communities of color. I lift that up because when we talk about the model minority and anti-Blackness and how those two things are juxtaposed, I see you, Angela, against each other. You know, there is the setup for Asians and Asian Americans to be seen as smart and quiet and meek, and for Black people to be seen as lazy, uneducated thugs. And when we have phrasing like Yellow Peril supports Black power, I just want to emphasize that supporting each other is not, we don't do it to be nice and kind because it is the right thing to do. In actuality, our liberation is tied up in each other. That's really what this is about. And so when we show up for each other, we're actually showing up for ourselves and for our communities. And I just want to I think that's important. You know, I want to lift up that, you know, many women of color around Georgia, we do the labor, and we do it, and we are unseen, and we are invisible. And, you know, we are made more and more invisible when our citizenship status is different, when what our first language is different. Like, anything that sets us apart and other pushes us more and more into the background. And many women of color have been affected by COVID-19. We have a wall of remembrance on the Women of Color website, womenofcolorinitiative.org. And we ask you, if those that you know, women that are close to your heart, that are in your lives, in your communities, even if it's 2 or 3 distant people away, please put their names up on this wall of remembrance, because we deserve to be seen. You know, the final panel that is coming up is going to be on June 30th, and I hope that you all tune into that. And we have one more little slide that's going to come up. We only get better with your feedback. And this is for the panelists and the participants and the attendees. So please, you can scan the QR code with your phone, or, you know, there's also going to be a link in the chat, but please give us feedback and let us know, you know, what worked well for you, and what you'd like to see differently, what you're excited about, because we know we're going to see you at the final panel on June 30th. The last thing that I want to say is that we missed an opportunity to lift up one of the co-moderators. So I just want to say, Faria Khan, thank you so much for co-moderating. They are a senior at Georgia State University, a voter registration canvasser for NAPOV, and also volunteers with the Climate Reality Project. So just want to give you a great shout out for facilitating the second session, and a huge thank you to Preciosa Baluan for facilitating the first session. You all are the leaders that we look to. We are excited to be led by you because y'all are taking up the reins and moving us forward towards liberation and freedom and a future and a world that we want to live in. So again, please give us feedback, and I hope all of you take care of yourselves, your families, your loved ones, and have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing the space. Y'all have a good night.